The ogres are in the place that the Warriors of Chaos lived for all those long years. They're not the worst faction in the game, but they launched alongside Warhammer 3 and pretty much needed a rework the moment they landed. Nevertheless, the votes have spoken, and apparently you people on the Discord, which you can join in the description, want to know how to beat them. So let's dive in and find out. As usual, let's start with the campaign. The only real mechanic that I feel you need to deal with when fighting the ogres is their ogre camps. These are where they can recruit their most powerful units and act as their most powerful settlements, with the most building slots and possibly largest garrisons. They can build these camps pretty much anywhere on the map, including in your lands, and clearing them out can be a challenge if you leave it too late. Unlike normal settlements, these camps recruit their own garrisons, so you can potentially be dealing with a very elite army instead of the usual awkward mix that most factions have. Add on the fact that they still function like minor settlements with defenses and terrain which normally benefits the defender, and they can be very difficult to take out. Now, the one massive upside of all of this is that they take time to build up. If an ogre army stomps into your lands and places a camp, as long as you get to it pretty quick, it should be fairly easy to get rid of. It's when you leave them alone to build themselves up that you get into trouble. Now, they can also be backed up by nearby armies, which makes everything harder, but that's true of any settlement, so isn't really unique to the ogres. If you can, prioritize targeting camps over any settlements, as they can cut the legs out from nearby armies. These are the backbone of ogre gameplay, so wiping them from the map does a lot of damage to their game. Their regular settlements are also a little bit different to other factions, but not really in a way that makes them harder to take out. Everything they take can only be built up as a minor settlement with 3 building slots and limited defenses. This makes taking out all of their normal settlements much easier, since they'll never have a ridiculous garrison, but it does mean every battle will be one of those minor settlement maps, so if you're manually battling, be prepared for all that joy. This is more of a weakness than anything else, so enjoy the easier battles. The majority of the ogres also live in the mountains of Morn between Cathay and the Wasteland. This terrain is very difficult to get around if you don't have something like the Underways to make things quicker. Now, the ogres don't have anything like the Underways, which means that you'll be on equal footing, but still, it can take a lot of time with a lot of twists and turns, so if you're taking the fight to them, be prepared for it to take a disproportionately long amount of time. Lastly, the ogres are some of the best traders in the game, especially if you're talking about Greasus. Now, this in itself doesn't really do much to stop you aside from the potential missed trade income, however it can lead to other things which make your life difficult. For example, all this trading might grant them some alliances with other factions, making declaring war on them or any allies a lot more of a commitment. Getting involved in too many wars with too many factions is a great way to get a campaign way off the rails, so be cautious when declaring wars to make sure you're not going to get overwhelmed. Use the classic join war trick to get around this where possible, but if wars get declared on you by a big all alliance, start churning out armies and be ready for a big fight. Moving over to battle, and as usual, this is the place where I feel that ogres can give people real trouble. Their roster is a unique one, with the main power of course being the ogres themselves. The majority of their roster has high mass as well as high speed, making them into charging powerhouses. They're extremely hard to stop, even with the most elite of elite front lines. Add on the fact that all foot ogre units have ogre charge. This means they only lose half of their charge bonus when going into charge resistant units, so even spears and halberds can't really slow them down that much. As well as this, they can also get on mounts, making them even heavier and faster, piling on the same problem even more so. They also have a pretty great ranged roster with artillery and infantry that can rip entire armies apart from quite a distance without any real risk to themselves. So, one by one, let's work out how to counter each of these strengths and capitalize on some of their weaknesses. So, the speed and mass isn't really that counterable in the normal sense, since their ogre charge lets them ignore part of any charge resist. Does this mean you should bring non-resist units? No, of course not. Half resistance is better than none, obviously. It's just that you'll want to use them a little bit differently and be prepared for them to take quite a lot of damage on initial impact. Once ogres make contact, you'll want to do everything in your power to stop them being able to leave combat. If they do, they can loop back around for another charge and deal far more damage than they would in sustained melee. It's shocking how much better they are at cycle charging than sustained combat, so if you can keep them where they are, you should be able to take them down pretty easily, either with melee troops or ranged support. So, once they make contact, move your troops into them to surround them and close the gap they made when they first landed. For the unit they charged into, this will be a bit of a challenge, so use any nearby available melee troops or even cav to keep them locked in. Just stop them moving at all costs and their threat level practically disappears. Don't get me wrong, they're still fairly deadly melee, but compared to charging, this is much more dangerous for them. This works for both the melee ogres and the mounted options, since both rely on cycle charging to deal consistent, safe damage to keep themselves alive. It'll be harder or easier depending on what exactly you're up against and what angle they come from. Just do your best to keep them contained as best you can. Another problem with this charging is that they can be so powerful they'll pull straight through the front lines into your ranged troops, which is a much bigger problem. Once they get into your ranged, it can be nearly impossible to get them off with their high speed, so try to avoid this if at all possible. Keep your lines thicker rather than wider to increase the number of troops they have to push through to get to ranged units. Ogres have a fairly small entity count anyway, so this won't be much of a problem and is a great way to make lines thicker for them to push through and harder to escape as they'll bury themselves a lot deeper. If they try charging ranged infantry in the traditional sense, try to use some cav or monsters or whatever you have that has anti-large bonus to stop or at least slow them down. Then bring in ranged units to deal all of your real damage. And yeah, in case you're wondering what damage you're going to rely on to beat back an entire army of large units, it's ranged. Lots of it. Whatever you've got, focus fire on the biggest threats you can see and wipe them out one by one. The large hitboxes and small entity count will rout units in no time and get you to army losses threshold at a record speed. If they do keep pushing into ranged troops and shutting them down, just keep pulling back until you can fire whilst also bringing in other units to distract them. It's a frustrating cycle to constantly see your troops getting pulled back into melee, but it does work and you can get them firing and racking up kills in no time. As for their own missile troops, while they may be tougher than most ranged infantry, one thing they'll likely lack is extra protection. The ogres really have to make the approach to you, leaving their ranged troops stranded and vulnerable. This makes them the perfect targets for cav or whatever else you have that's fast. Now obviously these aren't your regular ranged troops, so you'll have a bit more of a fight on your hands than normal, but you can still cycle charge pretty much risk-free as long as the front lines are contained. Or stick to sustained combat if you have the cav for it and shut down their firing whilst getting in some more meaningful damage where you can. For their large missile threats like the Iron Blaster or Harpoon Launcher Stonehorn, extra support will likely be needed in the form of ranged to focus down large targets. This can be challenging with all the other areas range damage is needed, so do your best to keep them occupied with fast units before bringing in support once you can. The main thing you want to do is stop them firing. As long as they're not doing that, the value they get will be drastically reduced. So, to build an army against the Ogre Kingdoms, you're going to want the beefiest frontline you can get with plenty of armor, anti-large bonus and charge defense. They're still going to feel the pain, so try to minimize it as much as you can. These will obviously be absorbing that initial charge and trying to hold back the ogres as best they can to buy time for your armor to deal most of the real damage. For your ranged troops, I'd bring as much armor piercing as you can with bonus points if they're moderately survivable in melee. They're not going to be left in sustained combat for long, but they'll need to be able to at least survive while you bring something to pull them out. I won't worry too much about their firing arc since ogres are pretty large, so getting shots off shouldn't be a problem, whether it's standard ogres or something larger. I just focus on their survivability and speed since you want them out of combat as quickly as possible to get back to shooting. For cav, work with what you've got, but if you have something flying, it makes it much easier to get around their army. Since they're pretty fast all round, ground cav will have to do some maneuvering to get into position, whereas flyers can go straight overhead. If you have it, I'd aim for something that can do well and survive in sustained combat with bonus points of anti-large damage. They're going to want to engage backlines, ranged infantry and artillery to stop them firing and keep them busy if they can't take them down alone. The sustained combat comes in much more useful because you're going to be microing your ranged units and just about everything else in this army, so leaving the cav to it is just one less thing to think about. You could also bring some artillery if you've got it, but you'll need to pay them extra special attention to make sure they don't get taken down. If they're too close to the action, it's all too easy for them to get caught in melee, and unlike ranged infantry, they'll be a lot harder to pull out safely. As for what kind of artillery, I think anti-large single target damage is the way to go, so something like a cannon instead of a hellstorm. Their entity count is pretty low, so area damage is a little bit pointless. You're better off focusing on single targets and wiping them out one entity at a time. For leadership, I'd focus on buffing characters that can enhance the leadership, armor and defense of your troops to keep them alive during that initial charge. Doesn't matter if this is mages or auras or whatever, just something to inspire confidence as best you can. I'd also consider bringing in someone who's good at fighting on a fast mount to zip around the battlefield, bailing out your ranged troops. Sending in a lord or a hero can pull units off ranged troops easily since the AI vastly overvalues them, so it's a great way to save your units. Just make sure they don't get totally pinned down and taken out, otherwise you're looking at a pretty costly trade in campaign. With an army like this, you should be able to take on the ogres and just about live to tell the tale. The army I'm fighting here is almost certainly not going to be what you end up fighting in the campaign because, you know, AI. This is worst case scenario, and I, with all the battle skill that Yorkshire pudding, just about managed to eke out a victory. So against anything the campaign throws at you, you should be just fine. And that's everything for how to beat the Ogre Kingdoms. If I missed anything or if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want to know how to beat more factions, then why not check out this video here on the Chaos Dwarves.